They say some grief hardens you like sea glass, rounded by time, smoothed at the edges, but still faintly sharp if held too tightly. I knew this kind of grief intimately. The bell above my shop door chimed, slicing through the soft hush of mid-afternoon. Sunlight filtered through gauzy linen curtains, catching in swirls of dust above the wooden shelves. It was spring in Cape Stillwater, and the air smelled of brine, lilacs, and cardamom. I looked up from my notes, order slips, scrawled recipes, a list of customers needing refills of saffron and lavender buds, and saw a man standing in the doorway. He didn't speak right away, just looked around with a quiet attentiveness I wasn't used to in strangers. Most people stepped into my shop with a kind of giddy surprise, overwhelmed by the warmth and scent, the curious amber jars and canisters labeled in my precise cursive. But this man, he looked like he'd been here before in a dream and had simply returned to confirm it. He was tall, sun-lined face, eyes like whetstones, gray and flecked with something gold, or maybe I imagined that. 52, I would guess, though life had carved more into his expression than numbers could capture. His jacket was well-worn leather, his boots dusty with miles. "Do you have Persian rose petals?" he asked, his voice low and even, like something poured slowly. "Whole or ground?" I replied without thinking. He smiled, something almost imperceptible, and stepped closer. "Whole. If you have them." "I do," I said. "Back shelf, under the silver tins of Lapsang Sochong." He nodded and I watched him walk, measured, deliberate. The bell above the door had stopped swaying, but something in me hadn't. "My name is Violet Grayson. I'm 50. I own the Golden Hour, a tea and spice shop tucked on the edge of a gray-shingled boardwalk in this small coastal town. I am not lonely, but I live alone. I do not seek company, but I do not avoid it either. After the life I left behind in Manhattan, after the death of my son, the collapse of a 20-year marriage, and the unbearable silences that followed, I came here with the hollow ambition of disappearing. But I've found in the decades since that silence can be shaped. That solitude, when curated with care, becomes something else entirely. It becomes peace. So I wasn't looking for anything when James stepped through my door that day. But something in me knew, before he even spoke, that this wasn't going to be just another transaction. He wandered for a while, fingers brushing over spice jars like he was reading them by feel. He asked questions, real questions, about where I source my Himalayan coriander, how I infuse the Earl Grey with burnt orange peel. When he spoke, I felt seen in a way that startled me. Not as a merchant, not as a woman rebuilding her life, just as Violet. He bought rose petals, yes, and golden turmeric, and a small pouch of crushed vanilla bean. But he lingered long after the sale, sipping the sample tea I'd brewed that morning, oolong with pear blossom and a hint of thyme. We talked about books, travel, places we'd been, and places we hadn't yet let ourselves dream of. I learned that he was a widower, that he traveled often but never aimlessly, that he found comfort in quiet places, and had a soft spot for handwritten letters. And then just like that he left. The bell rang, the door closed, and I stood there, holding the warm ghost of our conversation in my chest, wondering how a man could walk in out of nowhere and make the air inside your ribcage feel different. Over the next few weeks, James came back, never with a pattern I could predict. Sometimes for tea, sometimes for nothing more than a quiet hello. Each time I learned a little more. That he'd lost his wife 4 years ago. That he wrote essays about old churches and forgotten trails for a travel magazine. That he admired silence not for its emptiness, but for what it allowed you to hear beneath it. And I, in return, found myself offering more than I usually did. I told him about my son Eli, how he died at 19 in a sudden brutal accident, how my husband, so skilled at healing others, couldn't bear the wound between us, how New York, with its noise and velocity, had become unbearable. I didn't cry when I told him. I never do. But his eyes didn't look away, and somehow that mattered more. That day, as he left again, I noticed something strange. The silence he left behind didn't feel like an absence. Felt like a pause. As if something in my life had just drawn breath. There are certain silences you begin to crave. The kind where nothing needs to be said because something deep inside you is already listening. James became that silence. He returned on a Thursday, when the rain fell in slow, forgiving sheets and the shop smelled of chai and cedarwood. I'd just finished arranging the spring teas, lavender oolong, peach blossom white, nettle mint, when I saw his shape through the fogged window pane. I didn't realize I was smiling until I caught my reflection in the glass. He stepped in, his jacket damp at the shoulders, hair speckled with rain, that same calm in his eyes. He smelled faintly of wet pine and something faintly spiced, like cardamom or maybe memory. "I brought you something," he said, and held out a cloth-wrapped bundle. I blinked, then slowly untied the twine. Inside was a book, leather-bound, well-loved. Leaves of Grass by Whitman. An edition older than either of us, edges gilded, spine cracked with use. "It was my wife's," he said softly. "She read it so often the pages began to smell like her." I didn't know what to say. My fingers brushed the cover like it might vanish. "She would have liked you," he added, voice hushed. "You both carry your solitude like it's sacred. But never cold." It wasn't a flirtation. It was something far deeper, more intimate. As though he was placing his grief beside mine gently, like two stones stacked on the edge of a river. "I'll take good care of it," I whispered. That afternoon stretched long and slow. We didn't speak much, just moved around each other, him reading in the back nook with a pot of pieur beside him, me restocking the cinnamon bark and refolding tea towels with hands that felt oddly fluttery. At one point he helped me bring down a jar of smoked paprika from the top shelf. His hand grazed mine in the reach, and something sparked, not dramatic, not cinematic, just warm. Just human. And I felt it. That dangerous, humming awareness of being seen. When he left that day, he paused at the door. The rain had stopped. The air outside glowed with that rare, soft gold that only appears after a storm has finished forgiving the sky. He looked at me like he wanted to say something more. But instead, he smiled and whispered, "Thank you for the quiet." Then he was gone. That night, I made tea just for myself, something I rarely did these days, and sat curled in my chair by the window, listening to the sea and reading Whitman under lamplight. I opened to a dog-eared page. "I am larger, better than I thought." I did not know I held so much goodness. I closed the book and let the words settle deep in my chest. I didn't know I could feel this again. Not desire exactly, not yet. But that pulse. That second heartbeat. The quiet call of someone stepping toward your life, not with fireworks, but with presence. A man who didn't ask for anything, yet gave so much just by staying in the room. And I realized something then. Maybe grief never truly ends. Maybe you just grow new skin around it. Maybe you build something beautiful with the pieces left behind. I traced the outline of his name in my mind, James, and wondered why it felt like something I'd once known, long ago. Like a story I had only half forgotten, waiting patiently to be remembered. The next morning I restocked the rose petals before opening, humming a tune I didn't recognize, but knew came from somewhere inside me. And just before I unlocked the door, I whispered something aloud, just to the air, just to myself. "Thank you for the quiet." But what I meant was thank you for returning me to myself. I didn't see James for 17 days. Not that I was counting at first. In those first few days, I simply noticed his absence the way one notices a window left slightly ajar or a song that cuts off mid-note. A faint awareness. An incompleteness. I went about my days as usual, sweeping the floors, blending new batches of tea, taking long walks down to the shore where the salt air tangled my hair and the wind whispered its familiar, wordless comfort. But then the silence stretched. And I began to ache. I told myself it was foolish to expect anything. He had never promised to return. Our connection had been quiet, tender, but never defined. Still, I caught myself looking out the window each time the bell above the door rang for someone else. I found excuses to brew extra tea in the afternoons, just in case. The copy of Leaves of Grass sat beside the register like a sleeping thing. I opened it often, but never moved it. It felt like his, even as it was now mine. His absence filled the store more than his presence ever had. The way he had occupied space, attentively, reverently, had left an imprint. I kept thinking, did he know what he was leaving behind? One night, I stayed late after closing, rearranging the old mahogany shelf where I kept my rarest blends. I didn't need to. It was already organized. But I needed something to hold on to. Something real. Outside, the sky bruised itself into a deep violet, the color of dusk that always reminded me of my son. Eli. I hadn't spoken his name aloud in weeks. Months, maybe. James had done something strange to me. Not just stirred desire or awakened possibility, but somehow he'd made room for grief again. Real grief. The kind I had kept in the back pantry of my heart, sealed tightly, labeled with the words "Do not touch." The night Eli died, I remember pressing his pillow against my chest, inhaling the scent of his shampoo, as if I could memorize him with my lungs. He'd been 19, light-haired, kind-eyed, wild and thoughtful like the sea in summer. There was an accident, one of those sharp, pointless things life sometimes hands you without apology, and everything unraveled. The marriage didn't survive. We became two ghosts floating in the same penthouse, each unable to look at the other without remembering who was missing between us. So I left. I moved here. I renamed myself in a way. Dropped the "et" from Violetta. Left behind the designer boots and Upper East Side dinner parties. Traded them for turmeric and quiet. And then James had walked in. Like a match held too long in the dark. When the 17th day passed, I stopped waiting. Instead, I began to change the shop. I painted the back wall a deep smoky blue. I rearranged the seating area by the window. Added pillows in burnt orange and cinnamon. I created a new blend, a wild thing, earthy and floral with black currant and elderflower, cinnamon bark and a hint of black tea smoked with cherrywood. I named it Wanderer. People began to ask for it again and again. "What's in it?" They'd ask and I'd smile and say, "Something unexpected," but I never mentioned him. Not once. Not even to myself. One night I lit candles all around the shop, just for me. I brewed a cup of Wanderer, placed it in the window, and sat on the stool with my knees pulled to my chest. The moon was high and full, casting long silver ribbons across the floor. I didn't cry. I didn't reach for a phone. I didn't ask the sky for anything. Instead, I whispered into the silence, the way one might whisper into the ocean. "Thank you for leaving." And in that moment I meant it. Because something had begun to shift again, not backward, not into grief, but forward. Into flight. James hadn't broken anything in me. He'd loosened the hinges. I began to wake with a restlessness that felt new. Not the anxious kind. Not the dread-lace flutter I once carried through sleepless nights in Manhattan, when even silence sounded like sirens in the distance. No, this was different. Quieter. Like something inside me had turned over in the soil, reaching toward light it wasn't sure existed yet. Started with small changes. I opened the front windows of the shop each morning, letting in the coastal air even when it was still cool. I rearranged the front display, not for efficiency but for joy. I began wearing color again. Plum sweaters, a mustard yellow scarf I hadn't touched in years. I played records on my old Crosley behind the counter. Nina Simone. Bill Evans. A little Joni Mitchell when the light hit the jars just right. And I started saying yes. Yes to the young woman from the bookstore across the street who asked if we could do a joint poetry and tea evening on Thursdays. Yes to the older man with a camera and a gentle stammer who asked to photograph my store, because the light here makes shadows look kind. Yes to the local paper, which wanted to feature the golden hour in their spring series on women-owned shops in Cape Stillwater. Each yes was a door. A breath. A small act of defiance against the version of me that believed life had closed its hands around what was possible. Still I thought of James. Not constantly. Not painfully. But in flashes like the echo of a warm hand once pressed against your back in a crowded room. One evening just after twilight, I walked down to the edge of the water. The tide was low, the air gentle and thick with the scent of salt and pine. I hadn't been to the shore in weeks, not since the first warm day had sent the gulls spiraling into the wind. I brought a thermos of Wanderer with me and sat barefoot on the driftwood bench that overlooked the cove. The sea stretched wide and dark, glinting where the moonlight caught it. I could hear the clink of boats in the distance, and the occasional laugh from the inn up the hill, but mostly, it was just the ocean breathing. I poured the tea, steam curling like a question mark in the air. Sipped slowly. Let the warmth move through me. And I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the beginning of my second life. Not defined by who I'd lost. Not tethered to who I used to be. Not even tied to James and the way he made me feel seen, desired, stirred from the inside out. But a life I could claim as wholly mine. The wind picked up a little, carrying the sound of chimes from someone's porch, and I closed my eyes. I remembered how I used to dream of escape. How I used to imagine what it would feel like to walk down a street and not be someone's anything. Not a mother, not a wife, not the woman who once was. And here I was, unnamed by the past, answering only to myself. When I returned to the shop that night, the sky was velvet dark and the streets nearly empty. I unlocked the front door not out of routine but with reverence. This place, it had become something more than a livelihood. It was a sanctuary. A mirror. A kind of chapel where people came to taste, to remember, to feel. I left the lights off. Let the darkness cradle the shelves. I moved through it slowly, fingers trailing the counters, the tins, the familiar corners. And then without thinking I whispered, "I'm ready." Not to him. Not to James. But to whatever came next. To the next pull of the tide. To the next yes. To the next kind stranger who might walk through the door and change nothing but awaken everything. The first time I noticed it, I was blending a batch of hibiscus and lime peel, the sun pouring through the windows like honey. The world outside was waking up. Dog walkers with tangled leashes, early surfers with boards strapped to the backs of their trucks, a couple arguing sweetly over where to get muffins. And I was humming. Actually humming. I paused, the mortar still in my hand, the tangy floral scent rising around me. I hadn't heard myself hum in years. Maybe decades. The sound felt unfamiliar and intimate, like catching your own reflection laughing when you weren't trying to smile. Something was shifting. And it wasn't just inside me. More people had begun coming into the shop. Not just regulars, but new faces. Travelers passing through. Locals I'd never met, drawn by the poetry nights or word of mouth or the way the scent of cinnamon and ginger leaked onto the sidewalk like an invitation. There was one woman, Talia, 40, maybe, always with paint on her jeans and half a dozen bangles clinking at her wrist, who came in every Saturday just to sit by the window and sketch. One day, without asking, she left a drawing on the counter when she left. It was of me behind the counter, pouring tea, a soft half-smile on my face. The lines were loose and alive, the kind of sketch that captured essence instead of detail. I stared at it for a long time after she left. Is that how they see me now? Alive. Warm. Open. I pinned it to the corkboard above the cash register and felt something swell in my chest, not pride exactly. More like permission. A few days later, I started a community herb garden in the back alley behind the shop. Just a few planters at first, chamomile, lemon balm, a sprawling rosemary bush that had been begging for sun. I left the handwritten note on the side. Take what you need. Leave what you can. Within a week, someone had added mint. Then marigold. Then thyme. Cape Stillwater was responding to me in a way it never had before, not because it had changed, but because I had. I was no longer hiding here. I was living here. And slowly I was letting myself be seen. Not as the woman who ran the quiet shop with the sad eyes and the elegant stillness, but as Violet. Just Violet. 50 years old. Tender. Strong. Learning how to unfurl. One evening I was closing up when I heard the bell above the door jingle softly. I turned, expecting a late customer. But it was Maggie, my neighbor from 2 doors down, holding a small basket of scones and an awkward smile. I made too many, she said, holding them out. Fig and honey. Thought you might want some. I blinked, surprised. We'd exchanged pleasantries before, but nothing more than weather and mail mishaps. Thank you, I said, taking the basket with both hands. She hesitated, then added, You've made this street feel different lately. Like we're part of something. Just wanted you to know. I nodded, unable to speak. After she left, I sat on the floor of the shop, the lights low, the scent of figs mingling with the ghost of rose hips and peppercorn. I ate a scone with my fingers, barefoot and grateful, and let the moment settle over me like a blessing. This wasn't about James anymore. Not really. It had never been about being chosen by someone else. It was about choosing myself again. My body. My days. My name. Violet. Once a flower. Now in bloom. I used to think closure came in a sealed envelope. Words written carefully, explanations offered, emotions tied off with neat punctuation. But I've come to understand that life rarely hands you such things. Sometimes what you need most is the letter that never arrives. It was a Monday when his name returned. Not his voice. Not his body. Just the name. A woman in her 60s, with a straw sun hat and a voice like cracked porcelain, was browsing the saffron and said casually, I actually heard about your shop from a man I met in Montana. James, he said you made a tea that reminded him of an orchard in winter. The air left my lungs. I stood frozen behind the counter, pen mid-scratch in the inventory ledger. The woman didn't notice. She had already moved on to the black cardamom, mumbling something about stew. James. Montana. It hit me like a warm wind carrying the scent of something half-forgotten. Not pain, exactly. Not even longing. Just the weight of a name carried across states, across silence, back into the soft circle of my life. I never told her I knew him. Didn't ask for details. What good would they do? He was alive, that was enough. Alive and remembering at least enough to speak of me to a stranger. After she left, I stood alone in the shop for a long while. What had I wanted, really, when he disappeared? A reason? A wound I could trace? Or had I simply wanted to matter enough to be missed aloud? I made myself a cup of wanderer and sat by the window, wrapping both hands around the mug like it might hold my pulse steady. Outside, the wind tangled the petals of the sidewalk cherry trees into the air like pale pink confetti. Spring had come early. Everything was beginning again, whether I was ready or not. I thought about writing to him. Once long ago I would have poured myself into the letter like tea into porcelain, careful, trembling, exact. But something in me knew this chapter wasn't meant to be written in past tense. It had already done its work. James had opened a door inside me. But it was I who stepped through it. That night, I walked to the post office anyway, the old one near the lighthouse that's only open in the afternoons now. I stood beneath the street lamp, listening to the waves far off beyond the dunes, and took a blank postcard from my coat pocket. I had written nothing on it. Not his name. Not mine. Just held it. Felt the curve of its corners. The strange weight of what isn't said. And then slowly I slipped it into the blue mailbox. No stamp. No address. Just the act. A surrender. A thank you. And maybe in some way a goodbye. When I returned home, I didn't feel hollow. I didn't even feel sad. I felt light. Slightly trembling. As if I'd just stepped into a warm, unfamiliar room and realized I'd forgotten how good it felt to belong to myself. In the mirror that evening, brushing my hair, I caught sight of something unexpected. My own eyes. Clear. Awake. Unafraid. The woman looking back at me wasn't waiting anymore. Not for love. Not for closure. Not even for explanation. She was simply becoming. It hung in the back of my closet, tucked between a linen shift and a raincoat, wrapped in dry cleaner's plastic like a forgotten thought. I had bought it on a whim years ago in Portland, lured by the way the fabric moved when I walked past the shop window. Deep teal silk with a low back and a bias cut that suggested confidence I didn't yet possess. I told myself I had nowhere to wear it. And then I told myself I wasn't the kind of woman who wore dresses like that anymore. But something shifted that week. Maybe it was the postcard I never sent. Maybe it was the garden, now blooming into reckless, vibrant life behind the shop. lavender and nasturtium and mint overrunning the raised beds like they had their own agenda. Or maybe it was just time. That Saturday, I lit candles in the shop window and hung a hand-lettered sign, "Closed at 5 today," for something beautiful. I went upstairs to my apartment above the store, pulled the dress from the closet, and laid it across the bed. For a moment, I simply stared. The silk caught the light like ocean water at dusk. I showered slowly, letting steam cloud the mirrors. My hands moved over my skin with unfamiliar tenderness, not inspection, not judgment, just presence. And then I stepped into the dress. It slid over me like a memory I didn't know I wanted to recall. Soft, fluid, almost reverent. My back was bare. My shoulders, freckled from the sun, glowed faintly. I twisted my hair up with a brass pin, left a few strands loose. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the woman I used to be, or the woman I thought I should become. I saw now. I saw me. And I whispered aloud, "You're still here." I didn't go to a party. There was no gallery opening, no waiting date. I simply walked down to the harbor as the sun slid low, the air thick with that golden hush that only arrives at the edge of evening. People glanced at me. Some smiled. A few nodded. But none of that mattered. Because for the first time in years I was in my body, not apologizing for it. Not editing it with angles and cardigans and careful glances. I let the silk dance around my legs. I let the breeze lift the hem. I let myself be looked at, yes, but more importantly, I let myself feel. There was music drifting from the open windows of a tavern nearby, something bluesy, a woman's voice like smoke. I stood at the edge of the dock, watching the boats bob gently, and let the sound settle into my spine. And I danced. Barefoot right there on the wood planks, dress clinging and whispering and singing with me. Not for anyone else. Not for the memory of James or the ghost of the city I left behind. Not even for Eli, though I felt him there too, soft as sea spray on my cheek. I danced because I could. Because I was still here. And I no longer needed permission to be radiant. It started as a whisper. A note slipped under the door on pale blue stationery, the edges crinkled from someone's nervous fingers. "Your tea helped me through the worst week of my life. I came in for something calming. I left with the sense that I hadn't been invisible. No name. No return address. Just a quiet gratitude, left like a flower in a vase you didn't know was waiting." Then there was the young mother with dark half-moons beneath her eyes who lingered after closing, asking softly if I had anything for the kind of exhaustion that isn't just physical. I made her a blend of tulsi, oat straw, and lemon balm, and we sat by the window while the kettle whispered on the stove. She didn't speak much, but she drank slowly, like each sip was a way of breathing again. 2 days later, she brought me a jar of honey she'd harvested herself. "From the hive behind the shed," she said, brushing hair from her eyes. "They're just beginning to thrive." And then came Frances. 67, fierce and unfiltered, with a silver pixie cut and stories that smelled of wild sage and mischief. She showed up on a Wednesday with a bag of dried rose hips and a half-baked plan to start a community circle for women of a certain age who don't give a damn anymore. "I want to talk about real things," she said, slapping her palm on the counter. "Grief and menopause and starting over and being angry and being horny and not apologizing for any of it." I blinked at her, then laughed. The kind of laugh that cracks something open in your ribs. "Where do you want to hold it?" I asked. She grinned. "Here." So we did. Every third Thursday, we moved the jars and tins to the shelves, brought out cushions and low stools, lit candles that smelled of wood smoke and bergamot. Women came with thermoses and trembling hands, sometimes with silence, sometimes with fury, always with stories. There were women newly widowed, women recently divorced, women who hadn't felt touched in years, women who had left behind entire selves in the rearview mirror. And slowly, tentatively, they began to speak. We spoke of bodies, how they changed, betrayed, surprised us. Of regrets we no longer carried. Of dreams that still whispered in the dark. One night, someone asked if I missed him, James. The question came gently, like sea foam lapping at a rock. I paused. Thought of the rose petals. The leather book. His hands wrapped around a mug like it was the first warm thing he'd held in years. "I miss who I was when he looked at me," I said finally. But I've learned how to look at myself that way now. And the women nodded, not with pity but with knowing. We were becoming something together. Not a club. Not a support group. Something wilder. A greenhouse in winter. A choir without sheet music. A place where the truth could root and rise. That night, I stayed behind to clean. But I didn't rush. I moved slowly barefoot, the scent of tea and candle wax still warm in the air. I stood in the middle of the shop, my life, and whispered aloud. I didn't just survive. I looked around at the soft lighting, the worn wood floors, the photo Francis had taken of the group intact beside the register. I'm thriving. And for the first time in a long, long while, I felt it all the way down to my bones. It was almost summer when I saw him again. The town had begun to hum with tourists, families in sandals and sun hats, couples wandering in and out of the salt air breeze with cones of melting ice cream. My shop, too, had softened into the season. Pitchers of iced hibiscus on the front table, linen curtains tied back to let the warmth spill through, the scent of lemon verbena drifting lazily through the air. I was arranging a display of tea tins when I looked up, and he was standing in the doorway. James. Not older. Not different. Just quieter, maybe. Like the sea after a long storm. His jacket was slung over his shoulder, his beard a little fuller, eyes as unreadable as ever, but I knew. I knew it was him before the bell above the door even finished ringing. He didn't speak at first. And I didn't ask. We just looked at each other across the soft, golden room, the distance between us filled with a silence I no longer feared. Finally, he stepped forward slowly. Violet. My name in his mouth felt like a page being turned gently, as if no dust had settled on it at all. I wasn't sure if you'd still be here, he said. I wasn't sure I would be either, I replied. That made him smile, sad and warm. I left without saying goodbye. I noticed. He winced a little, then glanced down at the floorboards. I had to go. Something in me was breaking, and I didn't know how to let you see that. I didn't move. I didn't reach for him. I simply let his words hang in the air, like herbs drying on a line, needing time, space, light. He looked back up. But I thought of you. Every day. I believed him. But something in me, some old ache, once raw and craving, had cooled into something else. Not indifference. No. I still felt the echo of his warmth in my bones. But I no longer needed him to finish a sentence I had already written on my own. I'm glad you came, I said gently. But I'm not waiting anymore. He nodded slowly. I didn't come to ask you to. We stood there, not as halves of a broken story, but as whole people who had once shared a moment and had gone on living. I made a tea, I said, turning to the shelf. It's called Wanderer. His eyes softened. That sounds like me. I smiled faintly. No. It sounds like me now. He laughed then, a soft, disbelieving laugh, as if he were surprised by the grace I offered so easily. May I try it? I poured him a cup. We sat by the window, the same spot where so much had begun. He sipped, closed his eyes, exhaled. It tastes like coming home, he said. It tastes, I whispered, like leaving. We didn't talk much after that. There wasn't much to say. He finished the tea, placed the empty cup down gently, and stood. You've made something beautiful here, he said. It's more than a shop. I know. He stepped toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. Goodbye, Violet. Goodbye, James. And he walked out into the warm, glowing dusk. This time, the bell above the door felt like a benediction. I stood for a long time after he left, letting the quiet settle back in. Not empty, not lonely. Just full with my life, with my breath, with the sky still turning outside. He had returned. But I had already arrived. The last day of June came with a breeze so light it felt imagined, as if the air itself were dreaming. The garden behind the shop had grown wild in the best way, basil spilling over the edge of its planter, sunflowers turning their shy faces toward the alley, the lavender bending under the weight of bees. I let it be unruly. I liked it better that way. That morning I opened the shop doors wide and stood barefoot behind the counter, steeping a new blend I'd called First Light, white tea, jasmine, and the tiniest flicker of ginger. I watched the steam rise and thought, I am no longer waiting for my life to begin. Because it had. Not suddenly. Not with drama or declarations, but quietly, steadily, like a tide. James's return had not undone me. It had reminded me of how far I'd come without him. And as the days passed, I felt nothing but gratitude for what we shared and for the letting go. That summer unfolded like silk. The poetry nights continued. The garden bloomed with strangers' offerings. Francis's circle of women expanded to include laughter, music, and a shared potluck of stories we were no longer afraid to tell. One woman came in on her 71st birthday, wearing a feather in her hair and ordering the Wanderer blend. "I heard it makes you remember who you were before you forgot," she said. I poured it for her with both hands and she wept after the first sip. Not because it was sad, but because it wasn't. And one afternoon, standing in the doorway of my shop, I watched a girl of maybe 20 spin barefoot in the sun outside. Spinning for no one. For no reason. Just because her body wanted to. I remembered being her. And I remembered not being her. And I felt the quiet miracle of being someone new now, someone who no longer needed to disappear in order to survive. A few weeks later, I did something I hadn't done since before Eli died. I left town. I closed the shop for 3 whole days. No excuse, no emergency, no grief. Just freedom. I packed a small bag, brewed a flask of tea, and drove north along the coast, letting the windows down, my playlist full of jazz and cello and wild, wordless joy. I stopped at a field of lupins, took off my shoes, and stood still until the wind lifted the hair from my shoulders. I stayed at a tiny inn that smelled of cedar and warm bread. I woke early and watched the ocean stitch the sky to itself. I ate strawberries for breakfast and walked until my calves ached, and I remembered I was still beautifully, deliciously alive. The second evening, I sat on a hill above the cliffs, knees hugged to my chest, watching the sun fall into the sea like a secret being kept. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I'm ready. Not for someone else. Not for what comes next. But for flight. Not away from anything. Toward everything." And now, when I open the doors to the golden hour each morning, I no longer ask what might be missing. Because I'm here. Because I stayed. Because I went. Because somehow, through solitude, grief, tenderness, and the wilderness of desire, I came back to myself. And she was not who I remembered. She was more. She was wings.